than the trackers had found, so they were obliged to make an average of the game that had been brought in. When all the guests had departed, it was killing to hear the old keeper's criticisms. Another important function was a large breakfast to all the mayors, conseillers d'arrondissement, and rich farmers of W's canton. That always took place at the chateau, and Madame A and I appeared at the table. There were all sorts and kinds, some men in dress coats and white gloves, some very rough specimens in corduroys and thick-nailed shoes, having begun life as garçons de ferme, ploughboys. They were all intelligent, well up in politics, and expressed themselves very well. But I think, on the whole, they were pleased when Madame A and I withdrew and they went into the gallery for their coffee and cigars. Madame A was extraordinarily easy, talked to them all. They came in exactly the same sort of equipage, a light, high, two-wheeled trap with a hood, except the mayor of La Ferté, our big town, who came in his Victoria. I often went with W to some of the big farms to see the sheep shearing and the dairies and cheese made. The farmer's wife in France is a very capable, hard-working woman, up early, seeing to everything herself, and ruling all her carters and ploughboys with a heavy hand. Once a week on market day, she takes her cheeses to the market town, driving herself in her high gig, and several times I have seen some of them coming home with a cow tied to their wagon behind, which they had bought at the market. They were always pleased to see us, delighted to show anything we wanted to see, offered us refreshment, bread and cheese, milk and wine, but never came to see me at the chateau. I made the round of all the chateaux with Madame A to make acquaintance with the neighbors. They were all rather far off, but I loved the long drives, almost always through the forest, which was quite beautiful in all seasons, changing like the sea. It was delightful in midsummer, the branches of the big trees almost meeting over our heads, making a perfect shade, and the long, straight green alleys stretching away before us as far as we could see. When the wood was a little less thick, the afternoon sun would make long zigzags of light through the trees and trace curious patterns upon the hard white road when we emerged occasionally, for a few minutes, from the depths of the forest at a crossroad. It was perfectly still, but summer stillness, when one hears the buzzing and fluttering wings of small birds and insects, and is conscious of life around one. End of section 1. Chapter 1, Chateau Life, Part 2. The most beautiful time for the forest is, of course, in the autumn. October and November are lovely months with the changing foliage, the red and yellow almost as vivid as in America, and always a foreground of moss and brown ferns, which grow very thick and high all through the forest. We used to drive sometimes over a thick carpet of red and yellow leaves, hardly hearing the horses' hoofs or the noise of the wheels, and when we turned our faces homeward toward the sunset, there was really a glory of color in the wood and sky. It was always curiously lonely. We rarely met anything or anyone. Occasionally, a group of woodcutters or boys exercising dogs and horses from the hunting stables of Villers-Cotterêts. At long intervals, we would come to a keeper's lodge, standing quite alone in the middle of the forest, generally near a carrefour, where several roads meet. There was always a small clearing, garden and kennels, and a perfectly comfortable house, but it must be a lonely life for the women when their husbands are off all day on their rounds. I asked one of them once, a pretty smiling young woman who always came out when the carriage passed, with 3 or 4 children hanging to her skirts, if she was never afraid, being alone with small children and no possibility of help if any drunkards or evilly disposed men came along. She said no, that tramps and vagabonds never came into the heart of the forest, and always kept clear of the keeper's house, as they never knew where he and his gun might be. She said she had had one awful night with a sick child. She was alone in the house with two other small children, almost babies, while her husband had to walk several miles to get a doctor. The long wait was terrible. I got to know all the keepers' wives on our side of the forest quite well, and it was always a great interest to them when we passed on horseback. So few women rode in that part of France in those days. Sometimes when we were in the heart of the forest, a stag with wide-spreading antlers would bound across the road. Sometimes a pretty roebuck would come to the edge of the wood and gallop quickly back as we got near. We had a nice couple at the lodge, an old cavalry soldier who had been for years coachman at the chateau and who had married a Scotchwoman, nurse of one of the children. It was curious to see the tall, gaunt figure of the Scotchwoman, always dressed in a short linsey skirt, loose jacket, and white cap. In the midst of the chattering, excitable women of the village, she looked so unlike them. Our peasant women wear, too, a short, thick skirt, loose jacket, and worsted or knit stockings, but they all wear sabots on their heads in a turban made of bright-colored cotton. The older women, of course. The girls wear nothing on their heads. They became bent and wrinkled very soon, old women before their time, having worked always in the fields and carried heavy burdens on their backs. The Scotchwoman kept much to herself and rarely left the park. But all the women came to her with their troubles. Nearly always the same story, the men spending their earnings on drink and the poor mothers toiling and striving from dawn till dusk to give the little ones enough to eat. She was a strict Protestant, very taciturn and reserved, quite the type of the old Calvinist race who fought so hard against the Scarlet Woman when the beautiful and unhappy Mary Stuart was reigning in Scotland and trying to rule her wild subjects. I often went to see her, and she would tell me of her first days at the chateau, where everything was so different from what she was accustomed to. She didn't tell me what Madame A. did, that she was a very handsome girl and all the men of the establishment fell in love with her. There were dramas of jealousy when she finally decided to marry the coachman. Our chef had learned how to make various English cakes in London, and whenever he made buns or a plum pudding, we used to take some to her. She was a great reader, and we always kept the Times for her. And she and I sympathized with each other, two Anglo-Saxons married in France. Some of the traditions at the chateau were quite charming. I was sitting in the lodge one day talking with Madame Antoine, when the baker appeared with what seemed to me an extraordinary provision of bread. I said, "Does he leave the bread for the whole village with you?" "It is not for me, madam. It is for the traînards, tramps, who pass on the road." And she explained that all the chateau gave a piece of bread and 2 sous to any wayfarer who asked for food. She cut the bread into good thick slices and showed me a wooden bowl on the chimney filled with 2 sous pieces. While I was there, 2 men appeared at the big gates, which were always open in the day. They were strong, young fellows carrying their bundles, and a sort of pitchfork slung over their shoulders. They looked weary and footsore, their shoes worn in holes. They asked for something to drink and some tobacco, didn't care much for the water, which was all that Madame Antoine had to give them, but thanked her civilly enough for the bread and sous. The park wall was a good vantage ground to see all, and that wasn't much, that went on the high road. The diligence to Meaux passed twice a day, with a fine rattle of old wheels and chains and cracking of whips. It went down the steep hill well enough, but coming up was quite another affair. All the passengers and the driver got out always, and even then it was difficult to get the heavy, cumbersome vehicle up the hill, in winter particularly, when the roads were muddy and slippery. The driver knew us all well and was much interested in all that went on at the chateau. He often brought parcels, and occasionally people from the village who wanted to see W. Sometimes a blind piano tuner who came from Villers-Cotterêts. He was very kind to the poor blind man, helped him down most carefully from the diligence. and always brought him through the park gate.